Most men never realize the moment it happens. The exact second their financial fate quietly locks into place. It's not when they fail. It's not when they get fired. It's not even when they're broke. It's when they hesitate. Let me start with a truth that stings. If intelligence alone created wealth, professors would be billionaires and hedge funds would be run by philosophers. But walk through the real corridors of money, private rooms, quiet dinners, unrecorded deals, and you'll notice something unsettling. The men who win aren't always the sharpest. They're the most decisive. That realization shattered me years ago. I remember standing in a dimly lit conference hall, plastic chairs, bad coffee, men in ill-fitting suits trying to sound important. I assumed this room would be filled with brilliance, genius, Ivy League confidence. Instead, I watched a man walk on stage who looked uncomfortable in his own skin. His posture was off. His words stumbled. His slides were messy. Nothing about him screamed elite. The audience shifted impatiently. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned his monthly income. Not bragging, not flexing, just stating a number. It was more than most people make in a year. The room went silent. My chest tightened, because here was the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask. If he could do it, why not you? That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every assumption I'd ever held about money, that you needed perfect timing, the right background, exceptional intelligence, the correct path, all lies. And Machiavelli warned us about this centuries ago. He wrote that fortune favors those who move before the world finishes debating. Yet modern men are trained to do the opposite. We're taught to wait, to over-prepare, to analyze every risk until the opportunity expires. We mistake caution for wisdom, but there is a difference between recklessness and strategic boldness, and almost no one is taught how to see it. Here's the dark truth. Most men don't fail because they choose wrong. They fail because they choose too late. They calculate endlessly, hoping for certainty. But certainty never comes. The market doesn't reward understanding. It rewards positioning. And the men who get rich understand one brutal rule. Movement creates clarity, not the other way around. This is where Machiavelli becomes dangerous. He didn't ask, is this morally perfect? He asked, will this destroy me? If the answer was no, he moved. That's the mindset gap separating you from wealth. Smart men imagine every possible failure. Strategic men measure survivability. One freezes, the other advances. And here's the part that hurts most. You don't need brilliance to start winning. You need endurance. You need the ability to stay in the game long enough for leverage to compound, skills, relationships, positioning. But most men never make it that far. They quit mentally long before they quit physically, because no one taught them how power actually works. And in the next part, I'm going to expose the silent psychological trap that keeps intelligent men poor, while average men quietly pass them by. It's subtle, it's invisible. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the trap no one warns intelligent men about. It feels productive, it sounds responsible, and it quietly ruins your financial life. I call it the illusion of preparation. Most men believe they're behind because they don't know enough yet. So they read one more book, watch one more video, take one more course, wait one more year. They tell themselves they're being smart. But what they're really doing is hiding. I've seen this pattern repeat in every industry. The man who knows everything about investing but never invests. The man who studies business models but never launches. The man who understands marketing theory but never sells. They aren't lazy. They're terrified of being exposed, because action removes excuses. As long as you're preparing, failure is hypothetical. Once you move, failure becomes visible, and visibility is what most men fear more than poverty. Machiavelli understood this flaw with brutal clarity. He observed that men prefer safe inaction over risky progress, even when inaction guarantees decline. He wrote that fortune behaves like a river. When calm, it can be channeled. When delayed, it floods and destroys. Translation: opportunity doesn't wait for confidence. It punishes hesitation. Here's a moment that still haunts me. I once met two men at the same starting line, same age, same resources, same ambitions. One was brilliant, truly sharp, could explain markets, psychology, systems. His mind was a weapon. The other was average, not stupid, not special, just willing. 3 years later, The gap between them was unrecognizable. The average man had momentum, cash flow, connections, options. The intelligent man had reasons. Reasons why the timing wasn't right. Reasons why the market changed. Reasons why the risk was higher than expected. He didn't lose because he chose wrong. He lost because he kept waiting for a perfect move. And here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no perfect entry. Only survivable ones. Machiavellian strategy is not about domination. It's about positioning yourself so mistakes don't kill you. Smart men ask, what's the optimal plan? Strategic men ask, what's the minimum move that keeps me alive and advancing? That difference compounds faster than intelligence ever could, because action creates feedback. Feedback creates adjustment. Adjustment creates leverage. Leverage creates wealth. But most men never experience this cycle. They're stuck in observation mode, watching others pass them while convincing themselves they're not ready yet. Let me be clear about something important. This isn't motivational fantasy. This is power dynamics. The world does not reward those who understand systems. It rewards those who enter systems early enough to matter. Wealth is not built in moments of genius. It's built in seasons of imperfect execution. And the cruel irony, the longer you wait, the higher the risk becomes, because once markets mature, margins shrink. Once opportunities are obvious, they're crowded. Once certainty appears, leverage disappears. That's why the bold seem lucky. They weren't lucky. They moved when others were still thinking. And here's where this becomes dangerous. Because once a man understands this, he has a choice. He can either accept the discomfort of early action, or accept a lifetime of watching lesser men live the life he calculated, but never claimed. In the next part, I'm going to break down the exact Machiavellian filter wealthy men use before every move. A simple question that cuts through fear, doubt, and overthinking instantly. Once you adopt it, hesitation becomes almost impossible, and most people will never forgive you for changing this way. There is one question powerful men ask that weakens fear instantly. It is not positive thinking. It is not confidence. It is not motivation. It is colder than all of them, and once it enters your thinking, you stop negotiating with your own doubt. Here is the question. If this fails, will it destroy me? That's it. Not will this succeed? Not what if I look stupid? Not what will people think? Just survivability. Machiavelli didn't admire reckless men, he despised them. What he respected were men who measured danger without dramatizing it. Most men exaggerate risk because they confuse discomfort with catastrophe. Losing money feels like death. Embarrassment feels permanent. Being judged feels irreversible. But none of it is fatal, and wealth is built by men who can separate pain from extinction. Let me give you a real example. A man once told me he wanted to start a business, but couldn't afford to fail. I asked him a simple question. If it fails, what happens? He paused. I go back to my job. Exactly. No ruin, no exile, no collapse, just ego damage. And ego damage is the tax of entry into power. Here's the brutal reality no one says out loud. Most risks that scare you are non-lethal, but your mind treats them as if they are. Why? Because society trains men to avoid visible failure at all costs. We reward obedience early in life. We punish deviation. We shame mistakes. So men grow up equating approval with safety. Machiavelli saw through this illusion centuries ago. He understood that fear is not eliminated by courage, it is eliminated by clarity. Once you define the downside accurately, fear loses its weapon. Ask yourself this honestly. If you launch and fail, are you dead? If you invest and lose, are you finished? If you speak and stumble, are you erased? No. But here's the twist most men miss. While you're protecting yourself from imaginary destruction, time is quietly destroying your leverage. Your energy fades. Your tolerance for risk shrinks. Your responsibilities grow. Inaction has consequences too. They're just slower and far more dangerous. Machiavellian men understand something unsettling. Delayed action carries hidden risk. Every year you wait, the entry cost rises. Every year you hesitate, competition multiplies. Every year you prepare, someone else compounds. This is why older men regret what they didn't attempt, not what they tried. Failures fade. Missed opportunities haunt.
And here's where strategy becomes ruthless. Wealth is not about avoiding loss. It's about ensuring losses don't remove you from the game. That's it. You don't need guaranteed success. You need survivable failure. Once you internalize this, your behavior changes overnight. You stop asking for permission. You stop waiting for validation. You stop needing confidence before action.
You act small, you act early, you act again, and repetition builds power faster than brilliance ever could. But here's the part no one prepares you for. Once you start moving this way, people will misunderstand you. They'll call you impulsive, reckless, arrogant. Because your calm in uncertainty exposes their fear. And not everyone wants you to escape the cage they accepted. In the next part, I'm going to explain why society subtly discourages men from becoming strategically independent and how Machiavellian thinkers exploit this without apology. This is where things get uncomfortable. Here's something no one tells you until it's too late. Society does not reward men who become strategically independent. It tolerates them, briefly. Then it tries to pull them back into line. Because a man who thinks for himself, moves without permission, and doesn't need approval, is hard to control. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. He saw that systems are not designed to make you powerful. They're designed to make you predictable. Predictable workers, predictable consumers, predictable thinkers. And the moment you stop following the script, something subtle happens. You feel resistance, not always direct opposition, often social pressure. Friends question you, family worries, colleagues mock, not because your ideas are bad, but because your movement threatens their stillness. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most men around you are not rooting for your escape. They're rooting for consistency, because your success forces them to confront their own inaction. So society installs invisible brakes. Be realistic. Don't rush. Play it safe. Wait until you're ready. These sound wise. They are not. They are delay commands. Machiavelli wrote that the greatest danger for a man seeking power is not enemies. It is hesitation encouraged by false advisors. And in the modern world, those advisors wear friendly faces. They mean well, but they've chosen safety over sovereignty. Let me show you how this plays out. A man decides to change his financial trajectory. He starts thinking in leverage instead of wages, ownership instead of hours, position instead of credentials. Suddenly, people who never built wealth become experts on risk. They warn him, they caution him, they remind him of everything that could go wrong. But notice something important. They never mention what goes wrong if he stays the same, because that would force honesty. Machiavellian thinkers are ruthless about this. They don't ask permission from those who won't bear the cost. They don't explain plans prematurely. They move quietly. Because the moment you declare intent, resistance forms. And here's the twist most men miss. The more uncertain your path is, the less validation you will receive. Early success looks like foolishness. Late success looks like destiny. That's why average men clap after the result, never before. So Machiavellian men operate under a simple rule. Never seek approval from those who benefit from your obedience. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. If you want wealth, you must temporarily tolerate misunderstanding. You must act before applause arrives. You must build while others doubt. And here's the hardest part. Loneliness is not a side effect, it's a feature. Because independence requires distance from opinions, from noise, from comfort. Most men quit here, not because the strategy failed, but because the social pressure became unbearable. They retreat back into normalcy, back into predictability, back into safe poverty. And that's the real trap. Because once you've seen this pattern, returning hurts more than failing forward. In the next part, I'm going to break down the single behavior shift that separates men who think strategically from men who become wealthy. It's not what you learn, it's what you stop doing. And this is where the transformation actually begins. Here is the shift almost no one is willing to make. It sounds small, it feels harmless, but it is the line between observers and owners. Wealthy men stop asking for permission from themselves. Most men don't realize how often they internally negotiate. I'll start when I feel confident. I'll move once I know more. I'll act after one more check. That inner dialogue feels rational. It isn't. It's a delay loop. Machiavelli understood that hesitation does not come from lack of information. It comes from over-respect for imagined consequences. Men rehearse disasters that never arrive. They argue with ghosts. And while they're negotiating internally, decisive men are already collecting data from the real world. Here's the hard truth. Momentum doesn't respond to intention. It responds to action. I've watched men talk themselves out of opportunities that could have changed their lives, not because the move was wrong, but because it felt premature. They wanted emotional permission before strategic permission. Machiavellian men reverse this order. They move first, then let confidence catch up. Because confidence is not a prerequisite, it's a byproduct. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. A strategic man doesn't ask, "Am I ready to start?" He asks, "What is the smallest irreversible step I can take today?" Not the perfect move, not the grand launch, just a step that creates commitment pressure. Commitment pressure is powerful. Once money is invested, pride is involved. Once reputation is attached, focus sharpens. Once effort is visible, excuses evaporate. That's why wealthy men intentionally create stakes. They force themselves into motion. Average men wait to feel safe. Strategic men create conditions where retreat becomes uncomfortable. This is where Machiavelli's thinking becomes sharp. He knew men perform best when escape is limited. Burn the ships, not dramatically, but strategically. Just enough that forward motion becomes easier than retreat. And here's what happens next. Once you act, even imperfectly, you gain something preparation can never give you. Signal. The world responds differently to men in motion. Opportunities appear. People engage. Information flows toward you. Not because you're smarter, but because you're active. This is one of the great lies of modern thinking. That clarity precedes action. In reality, clarity follows action. You don't see the terrain from the starting line. You see it while moving through it. And this is where most intelligent men fall behind. They refuse to move until the map is complete. But maps are drawn after exploration, not before. Here's another uncomfortable truth. Most men are not blocked by external limitations. They are blocked by internal permission systems installed years ago. Parents, teachers, authority figures, all teaching the same lesson. Don't move until you're certain. Machiavellian men discard this rule. They replace it with something far more effective. Move in ways that are survivable. That's it. Not safe, not guaranteed, just survivable. Once you adopt this lens, your life accelerates. You stop asking if something will work. You start asking how fast you'll learn if it doesn't. And learning speed beats intelligence every time. But there is a cost. Once you stop negotiating with yourself, you can no longer pretend you're stuck. Responsibility becomes unavoidable, and that terrifies most men. Because if your results change, you can't blame the system anymore. In the next part, I'm going to explain why accountability is the final barrier between intention and wealth, and why Machiavellian thinkers embrace it while others run from it. This is where excuses die. Here's the final wall most men never climb. Not money, not knowledge, not opportunity, accountability. Real accountability doesn't come from bosses or deadlines. It comes from looking at your life and admitting one brutal sentence. This is the result of my decisions. Most men avoid wealth, not because they lack skill, but because wealth removes excuses. When you're broke, you can blame the economy, your background, your timing, your boss. When you're strategically moving, there's no one left to blame. Machiavelli understood this deeply. He wrote that men prefer to depend on fortune because it absolves them of responsibility. If fate decides outcomes, then failure isn't personal. But the moment you adopt strategy, fate loses its power, and responsibility becomes unavoidable. Here's what that looks like in the real world. A man starts moving with intention. He takes calculated risks, he builds leverage, and suddenly, every outcome is his. Success feels heavier. Failure feels sharper, because there's no one else to point at. This is why many men subconsciously sabotage momentum. They retreat into distraction. They overcomplicate. They switch paths constantly. Not because the strategy stopped working, but because ownership became uncomfortable. Wealth demands a level of psychological maturity most men were never trained for. Because when you win, people expect more. And when you lose, there's nowhere to hide. Machiavellian men accept this trade instantly. They don't romanticize power. They understand its weight. They know that freedom is not comfort. It's responsibility without supervision. And that scares men who were trained to follow rules.
Let me say this clearly. If you want wealth, you must stop outsourcing your outcomes. No more waiting for permission, no more blaming circumstances, no more hiding behind preparation. Strategic men ask one question daily. What decision today moves leverage in my favor? Not dramatically, not heroically, incrementally, because power compounds quietly. Here's the shift that changes everything. Instead of asking, why isn't this working? They ask, what adjustment does this feedback demand?
No emotion, no ego, just iteration. This is why they grow faster. They don't interpret failure as identity. They interpret it as information, and information is fuel. Most men emotionally collapse after setbacks. Strategic men harvest them. But here's the twist no one talks about. Once you fully accept accountability, you become dangerous, because you can no longer be controlled with fear. Threats lose power. Judgment loses influence. Approval becomes irrelevant. You move based on outcomes, not opinions. And society doesn't know how to handle men like that, which is why it tries to shame them, call them selfish, cold, obsessed with money. But Machiavellian men don't argue. They just keep moving, because they understand something most never will. Wealth is not built by good intentions. It's built by relentless ownership of cause and effect. And in the next part, I'm going to reveal how wealthy men structure their lives to reduce emotional decision-making, so progress continues even when motivation disappears. This is where discipline replaces inspiration, and everything changes. Here's what separates men who break through from men who burn out. It's not discipline in the way people talk about it. It's environmental control. Wealthy men don't rely on motivation because motivation is unstable. They design systems that move them forward even when they feel nothing. Machiavelli understood this long before productivity books existed. He observed that men fail not because they lack will, but because their surroundings constantly pull them back into old behavior. So instead of fighting themselves, strategic men redesign the battlefield. Let me explain. Most men wake up and react to messages, to obligations, to noise. By the time they think about wealth, their best energy is already spent. Strategic men reverse this. They protect the first hours of their day like territory, not for relaxation, for leverage. This is where decisions are made that shape outcomes months ahead. And here's the key insight. Emotions are terrible commanders. Systems are excellent ones. A Machiavellian approach removes emotion from execution. You don't ask, do I feel like doing this? You ask, what is scheduled? Execution becomes automatic. That's why wealthy men appear calm. They're not constantly deciding. They've already decided. Let me show you the difference. An average man relies on motivation. A strategic man relies on structure. One breaks when life gets hard. The other keeps moving because the system doesn't care how he feels. This is not about extreme routines or monk-like isolation. It's about reducing decision fatigue. Every unnecessary choice drains willpower. Clothes, food, schedules. Machiavellian men simplify ruthlessly so their mental energy goes toward leverage. And here's the uncomfortable part. Once you design your life this way, you outgrow chaos. Drama feels expensive. Distractions feel dangerous. You start cutting things, habits, people, commitments, not out of cruelty but necessity, because progress demands focus, and focus demands sacrifice. Most men can't handle this stage. They feel guilty for prioritizing themselves. They feel selfish for protecting their time, but Machiavellian thinkers see time as non-renewable capital, and they guard it accordingly. Here's the paradox. The more you structure your life, the more freedom you gain. Because you're no longer fighting yourself daily. You're executing a plan, and plans compound. But there's one more layer. Systems alone are not enough, because eventually every man hits a ceiling, a point where effort alone stops producing growth. In the next part, I'm going to explain what that ceiling is, and how wealthy men break through it using leverage instead of labor. This is where money stops being about hard work, and starts being about positioning. There is a moment every ambitious man reaches where effort stops working. He works harder, moves faster, sleeps less. And yet, progress slows. This is the ceiling that breaks most men, because they were taught a dangerous lie, that wealth comes from effort. Effort is how you survive. Leverage is how you escape. Machiavelli understood this distinction clearly.
He warned that men who rely solely on personal strength will always be outpaced by those who command systems, alliances, and position. In modern terms, working harder will never outperform working with leverage. Let me make this concrete. There are only 4 forms of leverage that matter: time, capital, people, systems. If your income depends only on your time, you are capped, no matter how intelligent you are. Strategic men ask a different question: how do I earn while not directly present? That's where the real separation begins. But here's the trap. Most men chase leverage too early. They want scale before stability, automation before understanding,
Capital before competence. Machiavellian thinkers sequence things. First, learn through direct exposure. Second, stabilize outcomes. Third, multiply. This is why early effort still matters, but only temporarily. Effort builds skill. Skill builds leverage. Leverage builds wealth. Most men never make it past step 1. They mistake motion for progress, but progress requires transferability. If you stop and income stops, you don't own a system, you own a job, even if you're self-employed. This is where many intelligent men sabotage themselves. They build elegant cages, high-paying roles that demand constant attention, businesses that can't run without them, complex systems only they understand. They become indispensable and imprisoned. Machiavelli warned against this too. Power that depends entirely on your presence is fragile. True power operates without you. Here's the shift that changes everything. Instead of asking, how do I make more money? Strategic men ask, what can I build once that pays repeatedly? That question alters behavior immediately. You start documenting, delegating, standardizing. You think in assets, not tasks. This is why wealthy men seem patient. They're planting trees. They understand something most men don't. Short-term pain buys long-term independence. But here's the brutal reality. Leverage magnifies everything. Good systems scale success. Bad decisions scale failure, which is why Machiavellian men move carefully but decisively. They don't gamble. They position. And now we arrive at the final psychological hurdle. Once leverage enters the picture, fear returns, because now mistakes are bigger, stakes are higher, and many men retreat back to comfort right here. In the next part, I'm going to show you how wealthy men think about fear at high levels, and why they never let it slow their advance. This is the mindset that separates temporary success from lasting power. At higher levels, fear doesn't disappear. It evolves. The risks become quieter, but heavier. It's no longer about losing a little money. It's about losing status, reputation, momentum. This is where many men self-sabotage. They get close to real wealth, and suddenly become conservative, not strategically cautious, emotionally protective. Machiavelli warned about this exact moment. He observed that men who rise through boldness often fall through hesitation, because success makes them fearful of losing what they've built. Comfort dulls aggression. Stability weakens edge. So strategic men train themselves to think differently about fear. They don't ask, can I afford to lose? They ask, can I afford to stagnate? Because stagnation at higher levels is fatal. Markets move, alliances shift, advantages decay. Standing still is not neutral, it's retreat. Here's the discipline wealthy men adopt. They pre-decide how they will act under pressure. They don't improvise ethics or courage in the moment. They create rules. For example, I will always reinvest a fixed percentage, regardless of emotion. I will always move before competitors once data is sufficient. I will never let comfort dictate strategy. These rules protect them from fear-induced paralysis. Machiavelli understood that men who rely on emotion in moments of power become unpredictable, and therefore weak. Consistency is strength. Predictability to yourself is power. Let me say something most motivational content avoids. There is no final safety, no permanent arrival. Wealth is not a destination, it's a position you must defend, which is why Machiavellian men never stop scanning terrain. They watch incentives, they read shifts, they move before consensus forms. And here's the final realization. Fear is not your enemy. Attachment is. Fear says, be careful. Attachment says, don't change. Strategic men listen to the first and ignore the second. They are willing to disrupt themselves before the world does it for them. That's why they stay ahead. And now we reach the final part, the part where everything comes together, because understanding these principles is meaningless unless they change how you move tomorrow. In the final part, I'm going to give you the one question that ties every Machiavellian principle together. A question that, if asked daily, will quietly pull you out of stagnation and into momentum. This is not inspiration, this is instruction. Everything you've heard so far collapses into one question. A question so simple it feels harmless, yet almost no one asks it consistently. Here it is. What move today increases my leverage, even slightly? Not motivation, not mood, not ambition, leverage. Machiavelli understood that power is built through accumulation, not bursts of brilliance, small advantages, repeated daily, protected fiercely. This question cuts through confusion instantly because it forces honesty. Scrolling doesn't increase leverage. Complaining doesn't increase leverage. Waiting doesn't increase leverage. Movement does. Some days, leverage looks like skill acquisition. Other days, it looks like capital allocation. Sometimes it's a conversation. Sometimes it's a decision you've been avoiding. But it is always intentional. Here's the final truth. You don't stay broke because you're unintelligent. You stay broke because you've been trained to value comfort over position. And the moment you reverse that, your behavior changes, your calendar changes, your circle changes, slowly at first, then all at once. Machiavellian men don't announce transformation. They let results speak. They move quietly. They act early. They compound patiently. And one day, people call them lucky, not realizing they chose discomfort long before it paid. If there is one thing you take from this, let it be this. Wealth is not about knowing the game. It's about staying in it long enough to tilt the board. And that starts today. Not tomorrow, not when you're ready, not when you feel confident. Today. So I'll leave you with this. When you close this video, what is the one survivable move you will make? Because the men who get rich aren't waiting for permission anymore. They're already in motion.